Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, friends. Today I will discuss about ER model of your DBMS. You know, ER model is the most important model of your database management system. I hope you know about the database management system where you will store the data. Is called the database management system, and ER model is stand for E for entity, R for relationship model. Means that is your entity relationship model. So today I will present lecture on your entity relationship model, and I am sharing my screen. I think you can see my screen. Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Can you see my screen? Arpret, Pratik, and okay, okay. Now, in this lecture, I am discuss about entity relationship model. In this lecture, I will cover overview of your entity relationship model, and I will discuss also about what is entity relationship diagram, and I will discuss component of your ER diagram, and I will discuss about relationship. Before starting the ER model, I would like to explain relationship. You know, relationship is that define the between two entities is your relationship, like your father and son relationship, mother and daughter relationship, etc., etc. You know, ER model describe your structure of your database with the help of diagram. Means through the ER model, you can describe the database. You can describe the structure of your database through the ER model. If you have designed the ER model of your enterprise, so through the ER model, you can explain the whole database management system of your enterprise. That's why your ER model is compulsory. And I had told ER is stand for entity relationship diagram. And also you can say that ER model is a design or blueprint of a database that can later be implemented as a database. And the main components of your ER model are entity set, and your relationship set. Entity set entity set means collection of your same type entities is called the entity set, and your relationship set collection of your relationship where your many relationship are given. Okay, and now what is ER diagram? As per I had told, ER diagram show the relationship between entities. Also, you can say that ER diagram show the relationship among entity sets. Entity, I think all are known about the entity. Entity, you can say that person, place, or thing. That is your entity. Entity having the some characteristics like your student is your entity. Table is your entity. Teacher is your entity, because these are all having some characteristics. Then ER diagram show the relationship among entity set, and as per I had told, entity set is a group of similar type of entities, and these entities can have attributes. Entity have some characteristics is called the attributes. Like your student is your entity because student have some characteristics like your student having a particular name, student having particular father name, student course, student address, student phone number, student city, student area. These are the characteristics of your student. That's why your student is your entity. In the same manner, teacher is also your entity because teacher have some features, teachers have some characteristics like your teacher age, teacher salary, teacher date of joining, etc., etc. An entity is a table or attribute of a table in your database. So, by showing a relationship among tables and their attributes, and their attributes like your columns, columns of your table. Suppose you are having a table of your student. Obviously, student table having some columns, student having some characteristics, student having some attributes like your student name, student age, student father name, student mother name, student area, student mobile number, etc., etc. ER diagram show the complete logical structure of your database. As per I had told, through the ER diagram, you can describe to whole enterprise. Okay, and we are having I example, you can understand through the example. Suppose we are having two entities, student and college. Suppose we are having two entities, student and your college. Obviously, student will study in college. So student and college have a relationship between them. As per I told, student relationship between student and college is many to one, as a college can have many students. Relationship between student and college is many to one, because many to one, many students are study in your one college. That's why the relationship between student and college is that many to one. However, a student cannot study in multiple colleges at the same time. You know, suppose I am a student, so obviously I will study in college, but I can't study in multiple colleges. That's why I had told relationship is many to one between student and college, because there are so many students are study in your one college, and student cannot study in multiple college at the same time. That's why student entity has attributes such as student ID, student name, student address, student area, student phone number, student college, etc., etc. There are so many characteristics of your student. As per I had told, here, yes, Arprit, Mariam, Abu Bakar, and Pratik. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
okay. Here, I am presenting a simple ER diagram. I am presenting a diagram of entity relationship diagram. In this diagram, you can see there are two entities. First is your student and second is your college. How to represent the entity, I will discuss after some time. Here I am only describing the ER diagram. In this diagram, you can see there are two entities. First is your student and second is your college. You know, student having some characteristics. These are the attributes, like your student ID, student name, student address. You can take attribute, but here I have taken only three attributes of your student: student ID, student name, and student address. And also college entity having two attributes: college ID and college name. And relationship between student and college is to study. study in, obviously student will study in this in college. That's why I have taken the relationship is study in. Okay, now suppose you are having a table of a student. In this student table, you will take three attributes of a student, and if you are having another table of your college, and college table having attributes college ID and college name. So this is your simple ER diagram. Okay, where student and college are two entity. Student having some attributes, and college having two attributes college ID and college name. Okay, student ID, student name, and student address. These are the all attributes of your student, and college entity attributes are college ID and college name. Okay. I hope through this diagram of entity relationship, you have to understood about your entity relationship diagram. Okay, and you know, rectangle. Why I have to use the rectangle? Always you should keep one thing in your mind. When you will represent your entity set always, entity sets and your entity will always represent in rectangle. And you can see in given diagram, student is your entity, and student entity and entity is represented in your rectangle, and ellipse always your attributes will represent in your ellipse. You can see student ID, student roll number. These are the attributes as per I have told, and your these attributes always represent in your uh, ellipse. Okay, and your diamond will use for relationship set. When you want to define the relationship between two entities, always you will use the diamond. Here I have used the diamond for study in your relationship between student and your college. And the lines basically used for link attribute to entity set and entity set to the relationship set. That's why I have to use the lines. And double ellipse always used for multi-valued attributes. I will discuss about the multi-valued attributes after some points. You know, multiple attributes always represent in your double ellipse, and your dashed ellipse always represent in your derived attributes. In your dashed ellipse means always your derived attributes will always represent in your dashed ellipse. And your double rectangle shape is used for weak entity set. Weak entity set, what is weak entity set? I will explain after some time. Weak entity set means when your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. And your weak entity always represent in your double rectangle. And your double lines, total participation of your entity in a relationship set. So these are the all shapes, and your these shapes will use for represent the entity set, attributes, multiple attributes, derived attributes, etc., etc. And component of your ER diagram are entity, and in your entity, I will discuss about the weak entity and the attribute like your key, composite attribute, multi-valued attribute, and your derived attribute. I will discuss one by one. And the another component of your EI diagram is that one to one, one to many to one, and your many to many. These are the four types of relationship. First is your one to one to many, and your many to one. Okay, so means your components of your EI diagrams are entity, attributes, and your relationship. In your entity, I will discuss about weak entity, and there are four types of attribute: key attribute, composite attribute, multi-valued attribute, and your derived attribute. And your relationship are one to many to one, and your many to many. And I will discuss one by one. Means main components of your EI diagrams are entity, attribute, and your relationship. Okay. Entity, as per I had told, entity is your object or a component of your data. Always your entity will represent in your EI diagram through the rectangle. Means when you want to represent your entity, so your entity will always represent in your rectangle. Here I have taken an example. In the following EI diagram, we have two entity like your entity, student and your college. And you can see in my previous diagram, your student and college both are entities are represented in a rectangle. Okay. And these two entity have many to one relationship as many students study in a single college, as per I have discussed in my previous diagram, where I have taken the two entity, student and your college. And relationship between student and college is that many to one, because your many students are study in your one college. Okay. And your component, you can see in this given diagram, study is your relationship, and your student and your college both are entity. And study relationship between student and college I have presented. Okay. And now weak entity, if your one entity, means your if your entities depend on your another entity, is that your weak entity that cannot be uniquely identified by its own attributes. If your entity is not uniquely identified by on attributes and relies on the relationship with other entity is called the weak entity. In a one word, if your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. Always your weak entity will always represent in your double rectangle. For example, bank account cannot be uniquely identified without knowing the bank to which the account belong. Means you can't identify the bank account without knowing the bank which the account is belongs. Okay, means you can't identify the account if you don't know about your account is belong to this particular bank. That's why your big bank account is your big entity, because you can't identify the bank account without know your bank account is belong to this bank. Okay, so that's why bank account is your big entity. Okay, and now you can see here is your bank account is depend on your bank. Means your bank account is your weak entity. I am explaining again about the weak entity. If your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. Here I have taken an example. Your bank account, you you can't identify a bank account without knowing your bank account is belong to this particular bank. Okay, and now attributes. I had already told about the attribute means characteristics of your entity, features of your entity is called the attributes. Like your student is your entity, and your student attributes are student ID, student father name, mother name, student phone number, student at etc etc. In your ER model, four types of attributes are defined: key attribute, composite attribute, multi-valued attribute, and your derived attribute. Okay, key attribute. Key attribute can uniquely identify an entity from an entity set. It's called the key attribute. For example, through the student roll number, you can identify the particular student. Employee paying card. Through the PAN card, you can identify a particular employee. License, license number, Aadhaar card number. Through the Aadhaar card, you can identify to particular citizen. Okay. So key attribute like uniquely identified to an entity from an entity set is called the key attribute. As per I told, student roll number can uniquely identify a particular student. Key attribute is represent y overcome as other attributes. However, text is key attribute is underlined. Okay. You can see in my given diagram, student is your entity, and roll number, name, age, and address. These are the all attributes of your student. And through the roll number, you can identify the student. And now I am talking about the Composite attribute. Composite attribute that is a combination of other attributes is known as the composite attribute. For example, student address. Student address is a composite attribute because your address is the combination of your pin code number, state, your country, your area. That's why your student address is your composite attribute. Okay, so means your attribute that is the combination of your other attribute is known as composite attribute. And you can see in my given diagram, address is the combination of your pin code, state, country, and your area. And now I am talking about the multi-valued attribute. Multi-valued attribute that can hold multiple value is known as the multi-valued attribute. If your attribute that can hold the multiple value is known as the multi-valued attribute. And always your multi-valued attribute always represent in your double ovals in your ER diagram. Means when you are making a ER diagram of any enterprise, always you will represent the multi-valued attribute in your double ovals in your ER diagram. For example, a person can have more than one phone number. So that the phone number attribute is your multi-valued attribute. Because you know many people's having more than one number. Okay, so your phone number attribute is your multi-valued attribute. And you can see in this given diagram, your student is your entity. That's why I have represent student in your rectangle, and your student ID, date of birth, age, student name, and student phone. These are the all attributes. You know, age. You can see your age is represent in your dashed ellipse because that is your derived attribute. Okay, and your student name is represent in your single ellipse. Your student phone number is represent in your double ellipse. Student phone number is your multi-valued attribute. Okay, and your student ID. Okay, that means these are the all types of attribute like your derived attribute, multi-valued attribute, composite attribute, and your key attribute. Derived attribute. Derived attribute means if your attribute will derived from the another attribute is called the derived attribute. Your derived attribute is not directly present in your physical database. Like your age. Age is your derived attribute. Suppose you are having a database, and in your database, your date of birth is one of the attribute of your student table, and date of birth is physically present in your database, but age is not physically present in your database, but you can derive the age from your date of birth. As per I had told, your derived attribute is derived from the another attribute. Another attribute means date of birth. You can derive the age from the date of birth. That is belongs into your database. That's why I had told your age is not directly is not physically present in your database. That's why your age is your derived attribute. And I had already said your derived attribute will always present in your dashed ellipse. Okay. How can identify the age from your date of birth? Obviously, that is very simple. You can identify the age from your date of birth. How? Your present date minus your date of birth, and you can identify your employee age. That's why you can say that your age is your derived attribute, and your derived attribute is not physically present in your database. Only you can derive from the another attribute. Another attribute means here your date of birth. Through the date of birth, you can derive the age of your employee. Okay, and there are some questions which are related from your this lecture, like yes, Abubakar, Mariam, and Pratik, can you see my screen? And now I am asking the some questions which are related from this
Yes,
lecture.
sir.
Okay, Arpret, Pratik, I am asking some questions which are related from your. Okay, okay. Your mic is not working. Okay. If your mic is not working, you can directly type in your message box. Okay. And now I am asking some questions which are related from your this lecture, like your is the set of entity of the same type that share the same properties. Entity set, attribute set, relationship set, and your entity model. Obviously, you know your entity is a thing of your object in the real world that is distinguished from your all other object. Okay, and now entity is a obviously each person in a university is an entity, and describe property possessed by each entity set is entity, attribute, relationship, and your model. Obviously, possible attributes of the structure entity set are ID, name, department name, and your salary. The function that an entity play in a relationship is called that entity is participation, position, role, and your stance. You know, relationship is an association among several entities. The attribute name could be struck as an attribute consisting of first name, middle name, last name. This type of attribute is called, obviously, composite attribute can be divided into subparts. That is your other attributes. Obviously, you can divide your name in your three parts: your first name, your middle name, and your last name. That's why your answer will be composite attribute, and the attribute age is calculated from your date of birth. Obviously, I had told your age is your derived attribute because you can derive the age from your date of birth, and your age attribute is not directly present in your database, but your date of birth is directly present in your database. And your last question is that not applicable conditions be representation in your relation entity as NA0 null and your blank space. So obviously null NU always represent that the value is not present. Means if your value is not present in your particular column, so always you will specify the null. Your null always represent that is the value is not present. Okay. And now, if you have any query, any question regarding this lecture, so you can ask from me, Arpreet, Mariam, Abubakar, and your all students. If you have any query, you can ask from me. Arpreet, Prateek, and Mariam. Okay. No any query? Okay.
Yes.